be a combination of increased volume and decreased noise. So, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
You know, it's really exciting to see how many people are coming out to this. And I think it's tapping into something that's important in the community as we're trying to share different narratives, share different information, share different stories. And it's really exciting to see people come out. We're playing a little bit as those who came in the last couple of sessions with format. And we're thinking how format actually tries to disrupt space as well. Right? The sort of linear lecture hall notions has some use in some places. But that's not necessarily what we're about, certainly not every week. And so this notion of trying to create circles, and circles sort of emphasizing the lack of hierarchy and the sort of notion of inclusion and ideas of equality. And you're seeing that we've got to kind of have two circles, and then we had to create a third circle. But that's all exciting. But there are a few chairs on the inside. If people would like to shift around, or as people come in and need to find space, you can tell them that there's space on the inside. My name's Peter Hammer. I direct the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State Law School. But we have a whole team here that's behind it, and I want to kind of call out folks on the team so you can start to know and appreciate the folks in the background here. My colleague, Eliza Owen Perez, over here. I see Craig Register from the University of Michigan over here. I know Lolita is, Lolita Hernandez, there she is, waving from the hall. Great. Alana is not well today, but she's here in spirit. And Melba Boyd, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State, and a real champion of this as well. So a lot of people are working behind the scenes with different backgrounds, different institutions, different expertise to try to make this happen. But you make it possible, and that's why I'm saying we're very excited to have all of you here today. I want to give a shout out for the food. The food tonight was from Los Canales. We appreciate that, and we'll be sampling different cuisines from Detroit places during this. And we also have a slight review exercise. This is where both students and community members can get the notion of review.
And we also provide parking, and I'm not sure that everybody knows that. So the lot just across the street, lot 60, Wayne State lot 60, so just across Forest, we provide parking. So just drive up and tell the attendant that you're here with Detroiter Speaks, and we're paying for it for you. So
if that wasn't loud enough, there's free parking as well. Across the street in the lot. And you'll see a little, you have to sort of signal the person. They're sitting there with a light going on overhead, just tell them you're here with Detroiter Speak. The intentionality behind this with the food, with the parking, is to make this space accessible, right, and make it welcoming. And to move it out of the academic sphere and into the Cass Commons is also part of that spirit. Right? So share with your friends and colleagues and people who have similar interests if you're finding this worthwhile. On the review side, Eliza has prepared sort of a handout that talks about structural racism that was presented in our first discussion, just to kind of reinforce this notion. Because we're also trying to give you tools and frameworks, and as I like to say, structural racism presents a methodology, not an ideology. Right? It helps us frame things and ask questions. It doesn't tell us how we answer it. And everybody here is free to interpret it and try to apply it in ways that most make sense to them. But it's a helpful framework. And we'll try to be illustrating that in some of the talks that we're dealing with and try to apply that both historically to contemporary issues. And some of it is trying to make it simple and intuitive. Right? What are simple questions we can ask as we're trying to get a handle on complex questions? Right? And some of those questions are on the back. Who pays? Right? Who benefits? Who decides? Who's missing from the decision-making process? Right? So at the end of the day, real truths should be simple. And we want to be trying to emphasize kind of tools and questions and frames that will help us both understand historically what has taken place in Detroit, and as the arc of this program continues, get a sense of what's happening to today's issues. Right? So as we're moving along, tonight will be historical as I move into try to the transition. And I'm going to sit down because I need to kind of both hold the mic and work my computer at the same time. And it's much more important that you hear the voice and see the slides than you see me. Is this question of failed urbanism to failed regionalism. Right? And there are two other ideas I'd like to introduce that we'll sort of see in the presentation and perhaps have question and answer after the panelists speak. One is this application of systems thinking. How do we think of it systemically? How do we recognize systems? And as an application, how do we think about the dynamics of inequality? Right? So how does inequality get produced and reproduced over time is a question. And that leads into the sort of second theme, and that question is a notion of social reproduction. Right? So how do systems of hierarchy get reproduced over time? right? They may take different form, but they're serving similar functions. And we want to be more conscious of that from a systems perspective and try to spot some of those patterns. And we'll see some of that in the presentation. So the format for tonight, and I'll stop talking, we'll talk the whole 2 hours, is to have a brief presentation to kind of frame generally this notion from failed urbanism to failed regionalism. Then we've got 3 wonderful panelists, right, that will talk about different aspects of this from their own perspective. So we've got Deborah Bunkley, who's here, and she'll talk about her own experience and experience with her family. An important civil rights case in Hamtramck dealing with development. And it's a Judge Keith case, and it's still going on after almost 40 years. And she can give us kind of a personal perspective of what that meant for her family, what it meant growing up in Hamtramck, and the implications of that. And a lot of this has to be done through personal stories, right? It's not just sort of abstract ideas. Real people are affected, and we want to bring that reality in the room as well. Then Heather Thompson will talk about a broader kind of social, political, historical perspective on regionalism during this period, and help us try to think about the different forces that were at play in interacting with this. And then Ruth Johnson from the Transit will bring it sort of to a contemporary setting in terms of transportation. And there's no sort of tangible proof of the absence of effective regionalism than the absence of effective public transportation. And she'll give a little bit of historical background, but she'll talk about the work she's doing today. And this is a live political issue, right? So there's a notion of how do we apply it to today, and what are things that people in this room, you and your network of friends and colleagues, can be doing to try to make failed regionalism into less failed regionalism, and hopefully some notion of reconciliation and successful community within Southeast Michigan and the rest of the state. So that's the plan, and the plan is I'm going to try to control the time in ways that we preserve a healthy amount of time for discussion. Because the real magic is the people in this room and the conversations that can take place, having gathered everybody and tried to frame this conversation. So each presentation will be roughly kind of 15, 20-ish minutes, and then we'll try to be using time, and we'll be inviting you to be asking questions and giving comments, and I'll have a moderated discussion after that. So I think that maps are helpful, right? So we're thinking about from failed urbanism to failed regionalism. I want to get sort of stress as systems thinking, right? And kind of think about, in almost a meditative notion, what are the manifestations of inequality? What are the drivers of inequality? I often talk about the co-evolution between beliefs and institutions, and how they evolve over time and how they change shape, right? And we'll see a little bit of that today. And then we have to ask, what does race have to do with that? And that's where we plug in that notion of structural racism and some of the handouts and the theories that we're providing to contextualize this in terms of the social and historical context. But the main reason for the PowerPoints is to try to give you maps. And we'll post this both on the public and the student side so you can have the maps there and refer to them later. This is a census map of Detroit showing predominant race. Right? And it's going to be a story in black and white, and that's a limited story because we know the diversity is broader historically and broader in the present to that. We're going to use the sort of data from African American and European American lineage to tell the story. What we see here, and I can use my mouse a little bit, the green areas are predominant African American, right? And what you see is this huge tendency historically to be cabining, segregating, right? Ghettoizing the African American community. If people were gas molecules, right, they would be evenly distributed in this space, right? And so anytime you don't see even distribution of people, you should be asking why, right? And think about the social, political, often use of violence that was necessary to cabin people in these areas, right? So clear pattern historically of that. The next map, if I get the right cursor, shows density. So remember that area that was the green corridor, the tan, it's a bad color on this. The tan color shows density, and that's the highest density in the entire city. Right? So the area around Paradise Valley was the highest density. Density is typically associated with multifamily high-rise dwellings, right? And that would be fine if we were in New York, right, or Chicago. But what do we know historically about Detroit? Were no high-rise multifamily dwellings. So you're getting that level of density in the type of housing that we have in Detroit, which tells you how firmly packed in people are, right? And this ties into what Deborah's story will be. What's this black line that goes through the most dense part of the city? I-75. Right? So you take the African American neighborhood in Paradise Valley, you take the densest part of the city, and then you put a freeway through it. Right? And that freeway also went through Hamtramck, and it's part of the Hamtramck story of dislocating people there that Deborah will pick up on. Right? And when we build those freeways, we often give that a name. You know what name we give that? urban renewal, right? Development, right? So we want to interrogate what these words mean when we hear development. Right? Sounds nice, right? But who benefits? Who loses? Who pays? Who decides? Right? A little bit of context. The next series of maps are going to take, well, one reminder. We live in one of the most balkanized regions in the country in terms of the number of separate municipalities, and our home rule laws give these people like kingdom powers, right? You cannot annex land in Michigan, which means you have strategic manipulation and action around political boundaries. And one of the best illustrations of the inability to annex land is that we have cities inside cities in Detroit, right? How crazy is that? Right? But it shows that the geopolitical units do not map onto the real social issues, the real economic issues in play. The other reminder is that the growth regionally has happened over time. 50 years ago, 75 years ago, there were no suburbs, right? So the things that we take as the norm today, right, did not exist, right? They were created, co-created over time. Social reproduction, what was the evolution of beliefs and institutions that have created the segregation of race and wealth that we have? Next series of maps, I'm going to go through quickly, and I apologize again at the distance to see this. Focus on the green area. This is again 1950, but the Tri-County area, and you see the ghettoization. But you're going to see over time that the African-American population is going to spread, but it's going to be cabined largely to the city of Detroit. Right? And the social reproduction then is that we're going to have segregation, we're still going to have ghettos, but they're going to occupy entire cities as opposed to neighborhoods. Right? So as we go 1950, 1960 spreading out, 1970, 1980. By 1990, Detroit is almost all African-American. By the year 2000, right, it spills out into Southfield, right? But what about the entire rest? The other green blotch has another name, and we call that Pontiac, right? So we see the segregation in Pontiac, segregation in Flint, segregation in Detroit, right? I'm just going to go back and forth one more time just to sort of give you that sense of that growth, and you sort of see the change over time, but it's still ghettoization. It's not gas molecules. It's not uniformly distributed throughout the region. It is still tightly controlled segregation, right? And it's using the manipulation of political boundaries in order to exercise control spatially over where people can live and where people can't live. Now, anybody who's read Tom Segru's book would sort of say, well, what's the why here? Right? And Segru would say in The Origins of the Urban Crisis, yeah, deindustrialization is part of the story, certainly discrimination in housing is part of the story, certainly there's discrimination in labor markets. I want to sort of put that in sort of placeholders now, we can come back to that in the nature of discussion. We want to ask, why does this happen? What's the why behind these changes? And there's a physics of regional segregation. We had discussions last week of Dr. Ossian Sweet, and the discussion of how violence was used, right, to intimidate, to threaten, right, sometimes to kill people who cross the color line. That hasn't changed, right? What I try to tell my own students is those same people who form the neighborhood associations that use unsanctioned private violence to protect the color line, when they move to the suburbs, who do they become? City councilmen, right? Mayors, zoning board of appeals. Right? So the same attitudes, the same people, socially reproduce in a different location, and what was once illegal, exercise of private violence, now becomes control which is sanctioned by the state, under state authority in terms of what governments can do. Right? We want to sort of think about what's the physics, what's the dynamics that recreate these processes over time. All right, the last thing I want to do is focus on sort of an exercise of spatial mapping that leads to spatial racism. So it's going to be an opportunity map. And when you do an opportunity map, you're saying anybody would think, what is opportunity? Well, it's common sense. What's the quality of housing? What's the quality of employment? How good are the schools? Right? What's the health care? What's the public and private transportation that's available? What's the living environment? And we have opportunity experts in our society, opportunity arbitragers, and we call them real estate agents. Right? And what they're doing is buying and selling and spatially allocating opportunity. So think in your own mind. Imagine you're up on the space station, and you could look down on Southeast Michigan, and all you could see is the presence or absence of opportunity. Right? And you all know the region, so you can fill this map in. Think about areas in the region of high opportunity, and paint those areas dark, rich colors. Right? So we're associating high opportunity with dark, rich colors. Think alternatively about areas of low opportunity. Right? And paint those areas in light, pale colors. Right? And again, you're up on the space station, you look down, all you can see is opportunity. What is coming up is an ugly SEMCOG map, right? So get ready for that. Right? This is what opportunity looks like in Southeast Michigan, according to the Kirwan Institute of Ohio State. We have this light pale area here. Right? This is a 7-county area. This is the Tri-County area sort of cabin here. That, we said the name earlier. That opportunity desert is called what? Pontiac. Does that mean that there's no wealth or resources in Oakland County? No. You look around, there's rich resources, there's rich opportunity. It's one of the wealthiest counties in the country. All right? There's another area of low opportunity, geopolitically defined, down here. All right? And what's the name of this opportunity scarce area? Detroit. All right? So we have a segregation reproduced over time, right? Segregating out wealth and opportunity. The next slide will layer over the demographics of race. Right? And you've already seen it from the previous one, to sort of fill in the dots. Green dots represent predominant African American presence. Right? And I'll toggle back and forth a bit. What you see here is not just a segregation of wealth and opportunity. You see almost a complete spatial separation of race, wealth, and opportunity. And John Powell and some other scholars call that spatial racism. Right? And we have to think about that. And when I advocate, I think anybody that's addressing any social issue in Detroit has to start with this map. Right? And if you're not starting with this map as a fundamental frame of how you're thinking about housing, transportation, community relations, bankruptcy, emergency management, fiscal distress, right? You are not operating with the facts that you need to understand what's really happening. And again, social reproduction, there's a lineage to this. And we in our own minds, this co-evolution of beliefs and institutions, have to be able to take this journey to what were the beliefs and institutions that supported slavery? How did they transform but not fundamentally change, right, as a form of social oppression into Jim Crow, right? And then to challenge ourselves here in Southeast Michigan, which was really the ground zero of spatial racism in the country, how did Jim Crow in the South then get transformed through an evolution of beliefs and institutions into spatial racism, right? And to me, that's the short summary of one way to think about failed urbanism to failed regionalism. So, we're going to have 3 great panelists. This is the last slide, which I love. All right? We've got Deborah Bunkley, Heather Thompson, Ruth Johnson, who are going to share their wealth and experience. So thank you for coming. So they're going to introduce themselves briefly to talk about their background. So each one will sort of give a brief self-introduction as they're going into their comments.
I don't usually need a mic, but
Yeah,
I'll
it helps
try.
in this room.
Okay. I'm Deborah Bunkley, and
Can you
I
hold it?
currently...
Can you hold it a little bit closer, Deborah, just so everybody can hear? There you go.
I currently am employed with the University of Michigan, am dining, and will retire luckily this year. And I do volunteer work for the League of Women Voters. I was born in Georgia, and my family moved up here, came up on the train. I was 3 months old. Train station, which is now has windows in it, I understand. And we moved, they lived in Hamtramck from the time I was 3 months old until now, and I will tell you I'm 61 years old. We lived in over on Dyer in the projects, and then we moved to Dyer. And you can tell I-75 goes right through Dyer. What I want to tell you is I love growing up in Hamtramck. You know, I had a great childhood. You know, everyone knew each other. Nowadays, people say they assume all black folks know each other. Well, we really did know each other. I mean, not only did we, the kids, know each other, but our parents knew each other, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles. So yes, it was whenever there was any type of issues in school, not only did my parents show up, but all my friends' parents showed up. So guess what? They dealt with it. And they dealt with it quickly. So we had things taken care of. But Hamtramck is a 2.5-mile radius. There's 5 high schools. As I was growing up, 5 high schools in Hamtramck. One being a public high school where all the minorities went, and 4 being Polish. Immaculate Conception, Our Lady Queen of Apostles, St. Lad, and St. Florian. So that should tell you something. 5 high schools in a 2.5-mile radius, and 4 of them being Catholic. My best friends, though, were, you know, Polish, Ukrainian. You know, we had, I guess, you know, we weren't really apparent of the racism growing up until, you know, my friends started moving away. And what really did it was when the highway was coming through, And, you know, we just thought they're digging a big hole, no big deal. But two of my friends that, one, I'll just tell you, Cheryl Dean, her family, as they were moving out of the front, they were literally tearing down her garage. One of my friend, Cookie, her father was a police officer in Hamtramck. Yes, we had black police officers in Hamtramck too. So when we got in trouble, we didn't go to juvenile court. We actually got sent home and our parents dealt with us. So we had a good childhood. But Cookie, her house, they had to leave the lights on when they left so that they didn't tear down their house. So it was a big deal. The one thing I'll tell you is that the lawsuit started in 1953. I was born in 1954. And it will hopefully be done with. They're building 3 more houses in Hamtramck. They built 52, and I live 52 houses, and I live in one of the condos. There's 13 condos / townhouses. And I can't tell you everything about what's going on, but one things I will tell you is that it's a blessing. Because when the lawsuit was filed, and I guess they didn't plan on it lasting 40 years or still going on now, but it still is. And we benefited the best at the end because I live in a beautiful 3-floor bedroom, 3 levels, 4 bathrooms, 3-bedroom condominium. And the only thing that I have to pay on it is taxes and insurance. So it's a blessing, but unfortunately, I will tell you this, that there's a lot of people, because of the circumstances that are still going on in our community, in our society, will probably not end up with their homes or the condo, because people don't have jobs. People cannot pay just the taxes and insurance because they don't have jobs. They don't have, I'm fortunate that I work for the university, so I actually get a retirement. You know, I actually have a decent income, so I can afford it, but most of the people, and I will say it, a lot of the people will not have them. The one thing I do want to end this with is, one thing that I didn't realize until my good friend Sharon and Cookie pointed out to me. She said, you know, do you remember growing up? One of my best friends was Cindy. She lived right next door to me from the 6th grade until I left to go to college. And Sharon, her friend, they grew up, we went to school, walked to school together, you know, played together. She said, but do you remember the fact that you never saw the inside of their house? We were never allowed in their homes. And I had to think about that. I'm like, wow. No, I didn't think, but yeah, you're right. I lived next door to her from the 6th grade until I went to college. And I never saw the inside of her home. And she lived next door to me. And I called her grandmother Grandma. So, I'll just leave it there.
So, good evening. My name's Heather Thompson, and I guess I come here tonight wearing a couple of different hats. One of them is that I grew up in the city of Detroit. I went to Cass Tech High School and always lived in the city of Detroit. And in fact, when I had my kids, I still lived in the city of Detroit. And the only reason I ended up moving was because eventually I needed to get an academic job. So I moved to North Carolina, but always came back to Detroit and wanted to really understand what had happened to the city that I grew up in, because it was a city that I was, that molded and shaped me really fundamentally. I grew up in a city that had already become majority African American, which meant for me growing up that the smartest people I knew, all of the teachers, all of the people working in important jobs, all the people who I admired and looked up to were African American. And then when I left for college and went out into the broader world, everyone talked about Detroit like it was a place I didn't recognize. And suburbanites talked about Detroit like it was a place that I didn't recognize. So part of the reason I became a historian was I wanted to understand why that was. What had happened? What was it that made Detroit the segregated city that it was? What brought so much antipathy between the suburbs and the city and so forth? So that's the one hat, which is that I grew up here and have always really been very interested in not just rebuilding Detroit and being a part of Detroit, but also understanding how we got here. The second hat that I wear is as an academic who Teaches at U of M now. I do a history of Detroit class, so any of you U of M students come see me in the RC next winter for sure. We'll do history of Detroit if you're not already doing it. But also I'm a historian that works on the issues of crime and punishment and mass incarceration, and that's what I do mostly around the country in DC, doing a lot of talks on that. And all of that wraps into what I want to talk to you about today, which is that I have very recently found myself frustrated at a lot of kind of booster, let's rebuild Detroit kind of public discussions in this vein of regionalism. And there's a lot of energy and a lot of positivity. Let's connect Detroit to the region again. Let's get regional transit, right? Let's get some real communication between Lansing and Detroit, between the suburbs and Detroit. And everyone has all these incredibly good ideas and always seems a little bit mystified why they're hard to implement and why it might be taking a little bit of time and what the barriers may be. So for me, I think it's really, really important that if we're going to talk about regionalism and what the barriers to it are or what the challenges are, to something that I think would actually be really good for all of us, which is the cooperation and the regionalism. We need to understand how we got here more. So as a historian, I really think we need to start talking about the realities of how we got here if we ever hope to undo them so that we don't repeat them, and also so that we have some hope of undoing them. And so in short, what I want to say is that those maps that Peter just showed you, we have this tendency in America, particularly when we look at urban history, to look at that and we shake our head and we say, yeah, it's familiar, I know that. And depending on who you are and where you grew up, you either grew up in the green dot or you grew up in one of those really dark dotted areas up there. And this is a very familiar story to us. But what we sometimes forget is that this is man-made. This is people-made. This is not inevitable. This is not the onward march of history. This is something that actually was created by human beings making political decisions. And we have to really understand how that happened if we hope to, again, undo some of those decisions. So just really, really quickly, I mean, the first thing we have to understand is that, I think as Peter's map shows, but even back in the 50s, things were hardly nirvana. So when we talk about repairing Detroit, and going back to where we were, building up Detroit the way it used to be, we need to be really clear about the way Detroit was in the 50s. Detroit was deeply segregated. Detroit had a serious problem with police brutality in the black community. Detroit had a serious problem with income inequality on racial lines. So what is it we want to go back to? I mean, I'm saying all this because I think we actually need to do something really differently the next time around. And what we need to understand is that's why there was such a contest for the city. When we have an urban uprising in 1967, it's not that people just lost their mind. It was that people were deeply frustrated with these deep inequalities that were so embedded in the fabric of the city. And I really see that period from the rebellion forward until the election of Young, and I talk about this in my book, Who's Detroit, as really a battle for the city. Right? Can we have a city that is really fully integrated, where we share power, where we share jobs, where we share education? And in short, Young gets elected and the majority of the white community says, no, we cannot. And if you look at the demographics of when most white folks leave the city, it begins, as Tom Segru says, in the 50s, but really there is a sharp movement of white flight after Young gets elected. And I see this very much as a story of whites losing power in the city, really abandoning the city. But the problem was, when whites left the city, they took all the resources with them. And so part of this story is about the removal of resources, the movement out of the city of goods and services, but also a deliberate anti-regionalism. Do you know that there was a moment in time during all of this when we would have had a school system that would have crossed county lines? We wouldn't have had the most segregated school system in the country. And then the suburbs fought it and said, no, hell no, our kids are not going to go across back to Detroit where we just moved from. They're going to stay in the suburbs. Again, a man-made, a human-made decision to not have regionalism. Same thing with transit, every opportunity to have transit across regional lines, actively blocked. And I'm not saying this to blame anybody now, I'm saying we got to understand where we were to understand the roots of this. Now meanwhile, in the city, We've got a mayor who, this is now Young, who is really responding to cues from Washington, D.C. and implementing a war on crime. And we are slowly beginning a mass incarceration of the city of Detroit. And we start this really in about 1973, 1974, and pretty much we have a situation today where if you go to the east side of Detroit, we have 1 in 22 people living under some form of correctional control. And again, not because that's where all the crimes are committed, not because, we all know for, white students at U of M like their drug sales and their drug use as much as the next person. But this is where the policing is. And so we have a complicated thing of the suburbanization, the regional abandonment of Detroit, SEMCOG basically saying, no, Detroit, you don't really have a place at the table, as you used to. And internal to Detroit, a real decimation because of the war on crime. Now, why am I telling this desperately depressing story? Because I think that now we can better understand why is there so much suspicion to regionalism? Because a lot of people for 40 years were deeply invested in not having regionalism. And why is it so hard to bring back to Detroit economically? Well, when you got 1 in 16 people in Brewer Park under some form of correctional control, they can't get a job. There's no income in these areas. When we talk about Detroit having lost its census population, everybody says, oh my God, Detroit used to have more than a million people, now they've got almost 699. And we talk about white flight, we talk about loss of jobs. Do you realize how many of those people are not being counted in Detroit because they're being counted in upstate prisons in Ionia and other counties? And by the way, being used for political power in those counties. They can't vote themselves, but their bodies being in those prisons count as census population for those districts. I gotta take my crime class too, which is always the fun. But why does all this matter? Because we have to tell the truth about how we got here, not as a blame game, but so that we can fix it. We need to deal with the drug war in Detroit. We need to deal with policing in Detroit. We need to deal with suburban hostility towards Detroit. And we need to deal with people, this issue of regionalism, by saying, yes, now, no matter what happened in the past, we are going to break down those barriers. We are going to start having regional transit, and it's actually good for all of us, notwithstanding that long history. But right now, people seem very mystified as to why we have these barriers. And we need to understand them so that we don't repeat them. The last thing I want to say, because I'm talking too much, is some of you got a chance to read a piece that I did on private policing in Detroit. And what I want to suggest is that the other reason we want to really understand how we got here is that we don't make things worse. What we don't want to do is bring back the city of Detroit on a totally privatized model. And I hope in that piece I persuaded you why. I think private policing is really, really dangerous. It's unregulated. It's not the solution. And greater policing in the city does not improve the devastation that we've already created through mass incarceration. So there's a lot of things on the table. I'm happy to talk about any piece of them. But as the historian, I'm sort of the naysayer here to sit here and say, we've got to understand the past so that we can then really, it's like truth and reconciliation, really deal with where we were so that then we can go to Ruth and we can say, how do we then redo this in a really productive and positive way and not have a failed regionalism, but have a totally new and positive and really exciting form of regionalism. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm the quiet one on the panel, so I hope we can have an interactive discussion, because whatever my experience or expertise is, there's greater experience and expertise, and I see those of us in this room and not in this room have the solutions to overcome the barriers and impediments to effective, equitable regional transit. Just by way of background, I'm not a native Detroiter. I might have been conceived on West Willis, but my parents would never quite tell me. My family lived in Ypsi, but I was born in Wayne, Michigan, so it gets more confusing. Whatever. So I grew up in Lansing, which has excellent public transportation. Is DeKalb Area Transit Authority. Went to Michigan State undergrad, go Spartans, which again is part of the CATA system. My mother's family's from Chicago, so I've always experienced good transit there. And we, travel different places, so I'm aware of what is good transit. Moved to Detroit to go to Wayne State University Law School, then went back to Lansing, now I've been in Detroit. I am a transit advocate. I work as the assistant director at Transportation Riders United. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to improving and promoting public transportation in Greater Detroit. And again, we don't pick anyone up, we don't drop anyone off, we do it through education, advocacy, and what I call our watchdog function. It's myself and the executive director, Megan Owens, and some great volunteers, great people in the community, great partners. TRU's been around for about 15 years. I've been advocating for more and better public transit for 5 years. But there was a 2-year period of time I was without a car. Now, I am a person of privilege in terms of my income and education, and I was self-employed. So when a client said, "Can you meet?" I'd pull it up and go, yes, because I checked the bus schedule. There are a lot of things I can talk about, my personal thing, but I really want to sort of do a funnel. Talk about some framing questions, and I'm not going to try to answer them. I'm here to give you, excuse me, information so you can begin to answer them individually and collectively, and then suggest ways of taking action. First of all, I would encourage you, if you're interested in understanding public transit and regionalism, to understand a little more about transit funding. Our sources are through federal, state, regional, and local. I have a handout over there that talks more about how different parts of the transportation puzzle, including road funding, is funded. I also have a sheet about our current transportation providers and services, as well as transportation decision makers from federal to local. I think what's really important is understanding your roles and responsibilities as regional stakeholders. Let me give you a little sense of past, present, and spend more time on the near future, because there are a lot of exciting developments that we can help shape what regional transit will look like in the coming years. So some of you may be aware that Detroit had one of the largest municipally owned and operated transportation systems. How many people knew that? Okay. How many people have actually ridden on DDOT or some service, either fixed bus? Okay. SMART, the ride, Ann Arbor, Washington area. People Mover, come on. I joke a little bit, but it is a good form of transit for many people, both visitors and people who live, work, and play downtown. And it was supposed to be a larger system. We also, when I talk about public transit, I talk about Transit Windsor. Many people use that to get from Canada to the US. They're paratransit for seniors and people with disabilities, some specialized supplemental services for job access, things like that. So for all those people saying, we don't have no transit, that's not true. I know it's nice to say that. We are one of the few metropolitan areas that we do have a SMART bus that goes to the airport, but I was telling my friend Sean here, it's like any other city bus, it stops at every stop. It's not an express or anything else. What's different about our region is it has been affected by some of the other urban policies, whether around housing, freeways, segregation. A lot of people say, well, we are a motor city. However, there are other cities that are comparable in population, density, and size and are also very auto-centric that have better public transit. That is part of it, but I would ask you to think a little broader. So some of the things I would ask you as you're thinking about regional transit, think about who decides. Again, I have a handout about the official decision makers, but there are unofficial decision makers. They're planners and more of the administrative, ministerial people but I would include each one of us as a regional transit decision maker through our votes, through our voices. But then, who really controls the narrative and the messaging? Again, there are people who are paid to do that, whether they're journalists or others. But I also would say we have a role and responsibility of what we say about transit and getting accurate information. Who pays? That's going to always be an important point of any type of regional discussion. But also, who is impacted? Who's benefiting? Who is burdened? And with any type of system, there are burdens beyond just the pay. You know, a lot of us say, I really don't use it, I want to pay for it. But that's not the only way to look at that, because then we would not have a lot of public services. If you only had to pay once your house is on fire, then you start throwing money to the firefighter, that's probably not a good system, right? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, in the context of more present to near future, what are the opportunities and impediments to an equitable regional transit system. So first of all, I want to introduce a topic, or for some of you it will be a reminder, a refresher, of transportation equity. A lot of times people say, oh, we just need something that's just and equal. I don't want an equal transit system. I want one where those who are most needing of transit have benefit the most. But then you can even look at it whether it's vertical or horizontal. So if everybody is similarly situated, should they all? So if there's people in northern Oakland or northern Macomb who've chosen to move there, but now they're seniors, should they have the same level of service as a senior in Detroit? I don't know, but that's something we need to think about. And then also the ability to pay. We, of course, know with our water system, our schools, other infrastructure, we have disinvested. And basically right now, the metropolitan Detroit area invests about $87 per person, whereas the average for comparable cities like Cleveland, San Jose, Phoenix, Charlotte is about $290 per person. And so my boss likes to say, we get what we don't pay for. At a certain point, we've just got to make a decision to have a regional transit system that we want, need, and are willing to pay for. There's also going to be tension between the current transit system and developing a more robust with other forms. We pretty much just have fixed bus service, the People Mover, which is an elevated guideway. I'm sure a lot of you know about M1, which is a streetcar from downtown to the boulevard. We can talk lots more about that. And then, as I said, paratransit, other specialized services. Most cities have a broader array or range of different transit services, but as we are trying to figure out how to create a truly regional system, there's going to be tension between making sure we continue to support and expand the fixed bus system that the majority of people currently rely upon in developing new transit. And there's some terms you might have heard, transit dependent versus choice riders. I use it, I'm not 100% comfortable with it, but it's a shorthand. My boss also likes to say, you're just a DUIL or a broken leg from needing public transit. So you may see yourself as not needing transit, but life can change very quickly. You can be diagnosed with epilepsy, being given medication, lots of different things. In terms of a framework for understanding the impacts of transportation equity, you can think about households without access to a motor vehicle, a personal motor vehicle. That could be physical ability to drive, again, for health reasons. It could be age. So I don't want a 5-year-old driving, right? Okay. And I don't automatically assume someone who's 65, 75, even 85 cannot drive. Most seniors self-restrict because of visual problems. They don't drive at night, or they don't make left-hand turns because they don't have the agility and reaction time to do that. But a lot of times we are looking at the economic ability to drive a personal vehicle. So it's either insurance, driver's license issues, maintenance, repair, gas. So even, some of you might have heard about James Robertson, the 21-mile man. I like to call him Super Negro, because I'm not willing to walk 21 miles. And so if that's the standard of what is seen as, it's okay to laugh, because I'm laughing, but if you're not sure, I'll let you know. That, you know, and I don't want to belittle the people out of the kindness of their heart gave him money for a car, insurance, a place to live. But for all that, the $20 or $30 to go fund me, that's about the $20 or $30 a year we need to fund regional transit. So I'm glad he's helped, but we had a campaign, there are thousands of James Robertsons, some who may never get the job, may not be able to keep the job, or aren't willing to walk 21 miles. Then even if you have a car, it's the total household income spent on transportation, on either a car, or if you don't have a car, alternate ways of getting around. The Metropolitan Detroit has a higher percentage of household income spent. So that gets to quality of life of other things you could spend the money. We have one of the highest pedestrian death and injury rates, how we design our streets that are basically, our lanes, like for telegraph, are wider than the Indy 500. And how the lights are timed, we all know we do this, right? You just, I can do this. And you can just keep, come on, we all do this. And you just keep driving. But imagine, and I've done this, try to cross Telegraph at like 7 Mile to get to a bus stop. I'm pretty healthy and, you know, but it was scary. And I've got the light, it was scary. Return on investment, on public investment. Anybody has investments, 401k, or plan to in the future, public transit gives about $4 to $10, depending on the mode, on every dollar invested. I said that's pretty darn good. That's both direct and indirect, as well as transit-oriented development. Then there's job creation and job access. But on the flip side of that job access and urban sprawl, at a certain point, we will never have a regional transit system as people move further and further away. And think about the quality of life, that if we no longer have neighborhood schools, and you're putting middle school and high school students on a bus, even if it's on time, even if it's affordable, is that the best thing? Is it okay for a working parent to have to get up at 5 o'clock and transfer 2 or 3 times so they're not there to make sure their child has a healthy breakfast? Or if their child's taking a bus going east and they're going west or north, meaning they can't get back to their child's school if there's a problem or a parent-teacher conference. So even if money was no object, that's Disneyland fantasy thinking, is that really the kind of communities that we want to live in? And that's really what transit is about. How does transit support the kind of communities we want to live in, rather than transit creating communities that many of us don't feel are suitable or equitable in terms of people's access to opportunities, whether it's healthcare, education, other economic opportunities. Transit should support that. In terms of framework for working towards a more equitable transit system, there is more attention, or at least more talk about transit, not necessarily action. We put all our plans and studies, they'd reach the moon. However, we do have a regional transit authority that was enacted in 2012, and that's for Wayne, Oakland, and Washtenaw counties. And they are in the process of developing a master plan that we expect to be released in May. I don't feel they've done adequate public participation. Just by show of hands, anybody knew that they're working on a master plan? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whew. So that's 6 out of, the large number of people. I don't think, given the importance and the investment that you're going to be asked to make, it will most likely be on the ballot in those 4 counties in November 8th. I would hope between now and November, those of us who are charged with the responsibility of providing education and engagement activities will do better. Some of the impediments are past decisions Heather talked about undoing. I don't know if we can undo. I think we need to destroy. If it's a unjust foundations, I don't know how you undo things, but I'm not sure if we're willing as Southeast Michigan region to do that. And many people, both politically, personally, have vested interest in maintaining the status quo. We have to deal with a post-bankruptcy Detroit, the population losses and shifts. I actually live in Warren, 11 in DeQuinder. Yes, I did pick someplace where I have 3 bus lines, but I'm no longer contributing to the Detroit tax base through my income, because I still, income taxes, I still work in Detroit. There's differentials in property value, so a lot of the transit is by millages, same problem with schools. Inequitable divisions of existing funding coming into the city, into the region. Right now, SMART and DDOT split the money coming in 50-50. And Detroit transit system has much more ridership, more routes, more everything, but it was more of a political thing. There are differences in operating costs, capital costs. There's political will versus public will, but it's hard for me to understand if we continue to elect people that don't support public transit, we should not be surprised. Some stuff is easy. And then I think there's just a general distrust or just disgust with government. Oh, those people. Well, those people, again, we elected them, we keep electing them, and to a certain extent, those people are of us. What can we do as individuals or as collections of people in either nonprofits, faith communities, business organizations, educational institutions? We can get informed, we can advocate, we can vote.
I'm going to try to make this less of a death trap. Is there a way to just turn that off?
I can help, Peter.
All right. So I really appreciate both the substance and depth of those, but also the fact that we have 45 minutes to actually have a conversation here. And so I just welcome people that want to ask a question of one of our panelists, want to raise issues that you'd like to go into further depth, identify issues that are missing, right? Things that we haven't addressed that should be on the table. So we've got a healthy amount of time that we can be talking with each other and learning from each other. So, yes, ma'am.
I'll ask the first question.
All right, and you're going to stand and project.
My question is related to the transit. Brooks Patterson has decided that he wants to put 2 more lanes on I-75, and the lanes are going to go from 8 Mile to I think almost to Pontiac. And so he wants to do this. It's going to be millions of dollars that it's going to cost. I'm wondering if that money would be better served if it was part of the regional transit. And has anyone talked to him about that?
I'll let Ruth.
Yes, yes. Okay. As the young lady said, although there are different silos and pots of money, but through our state transportation funding, and as you know, that was on the ballot and went downhill miserably. However, our legislature, with not a lot of input from the public, did pass a funding package that is built on myths and projections. However, over time, it probably will raise some money, and under the state transportation, the comprehensive transportation fund, up to 10% of all money going through the state is set aside for public transit. And fortunately, through our advocacy of a lot of people across the state, that was preserved. But also the city of Detroit got some flex funding in addition to that. As far as right now, we invest 90% in roads and bridges, and that's beyond just repairing them. So that's why we have opposed highway expansions, I-75, I-94, I-96, because studies show that it just ends up, it doesn't really resolve congestion. People just continue to drive and drive and drive. We do believe that it should be part of a regional transit plan that looks at all the ways that people can get around, because buses do need to get, use good roads and everything else. However, there's a group called the Motor City Freedom Riders, Joe Batterman, who's currently a master's degree candidate in urban planning at the U of M, are doing some actions directed at the county leaders and the RTA board members.
I mean, it seems rather antiquated to me, that you want to put in lanes instead of putting in like maybe a train.
That has been, I talked about the many plans and studies that has been discussed because that's what other regions do because it's already have the right of way. You're not gonna be like with I-94, they're talking about getting rid of the, residential other buildings. Again, I think we need to say what we want, and not what Brooks wants.
One of the benefits of starting to think in systems, right, is one thing about the entire system. And I love your questions, is really asking basic questions that they can't answer, right? Why do we look at Oakland County in separate from the entire region? Why do we look at roads separate from public transportation? Why don't we think about the social opportunity costs of widening those roads versus Head Start money, right? Or investing in other things. And everybody here should be empowered to be asking these intuitive questions and hopefully getting answers, right? But the roads historically, as we sort of go back to Deborah, right? Those roads when they're widened, right? When they were put through that neighborhood in the 1950s, that was called development, right? That was celebrated, and yet that came at a huge cost. And we don't appreciate that. We need to sort of learn from our history as Heather is encouraging us to do and tell new stories. And then you think about we have a population loss in Detroit, and we're going to expand I-94, right? And you say, well, why? Right? The why now is that the only thing we are valued on is a transit across Canada into the rest of the country. So is decision-making driven by business, right? The only thing that's relevant in Detroit is how much freight can be shipped through this, not the people living here. Right? And again, are we doing development that is focusing on people? Right? Are we doing development that's focusing on property and transit and corporate lives? There was a comment over here, so, and then we'll go back. So
I just wanted, you pretty much answered what I said. I think the reason about the 75 becoming wider, because sooner or later they have to accommodate all the truck traffic on Manning Rose Bridge, because they want that super highway from Canada all the way down to Mexico. We're gonna have so much truck traffic on 75.
They're already here.
I mean, it's bad now, for regular drivers, so I think you're right, that's exactly what it is.
and Lolita?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in the automotive industry in this because that's what I come out of, particularly General Motors. And my later years in General Motors, I worked for the UAWs, which gave me an opportunity to visit a lot of plants. And I used to refer to I-75 as the General Motors corridor. In the south, you had, starting from Toledo, you had those plants coming up, Clark Street, Turnstead, and then you go up through Flint, you go through Saginaw, Bay City, and all the way on up to the UAW thing. So my question is, as we're seeing some of the UAW plants shift and consolidate and further rationalize their production and add more robots and what have you, what is their input of the automotive industry into this discussion of the freeway system?
Who wants to jump on that?
Well, I mean, I think people tend to think about the auto industry as having a lot less influence now than it did, say, in the 50s, but we really minimize often how much influence the auto industry still has. Detroit has done backflips, right, to keep GM in the city, and auto politics are very important politics. And this question of whether we expand freeways versus expanding a regional transit system, again, we just have to be very clear about what people's self-interests are versus what the interest of the public good is. So it makes absolute sense. If you want to live out in Utica, it makes sense that you want to expand freeways to get yourself home more quickly. But if you're interested, if you don't have a car, your interest is going to be in expanding regional transit. Well, the auto industry is much more interested, obviously, in getting people in cars, or at least continuing to keep the people who are in cars. And it doesn't have to be conspiratorial to realize that part of this barrier, I think, and you're far more of an expert, obviously, than I am in this, Ruth, but it seems to me that we have to start talking about regional transit much more as a public good, because individually, there's probably for a lot of people why it's not clear why they would need regional transit. You know, because they would say, well, you know, I mean, other than going downtown to a Tiger game, I've got a car, I can go down, I can go home, and frankly, I just want a bigger freeway so I can get home more quickly. The only way we're gonna really get around this is to think about it as a public good, and even the auto industry, right, could retool itself, frankly, to start getting in the business of making, you know, trains and transit and so forth. And the lesson, quickly about that, you mentioned Charlotte. I lived in Charlotte for 12 years as a professor, and what I thought was so interesting is the battle over light rail in Charlotte was ferocious, because the people who had built the freeways, who wanted to live outside of the center city, didn't see the need for the light rail. And people were very blunt about it. What they said was, you know, look, frankly, I'd love to go into Charlotte, but I'm not sure I want those people in Charlotte to come out to my neighborhood. Right? Because transit's two ways. It's not just about going in, it's also being able to get out. But there's a really good news punchline, which is that in Charlotte, once they did get it in, people were like, damn, it's nice to not be behind the wheel of my car for 12 hours. So, you know, appealing to the public good ends up, I think, maybe eventually making people feel good about the public good.
I would just add to that, public good, you can see it in maybe 3 different ways. You can see it as sort of the social welfare, that's a public good. Transit, for transit's sake, is a public good, you know, moving people. Environment, economic development and economic opportunity and access. And sometimes there's tension, and I think M1 is a good example of that. If it was good transit, it would be in dedicated lanes, it would go further than it does. It would be quite a different project, even Charlotte, I think, yeah. But you also keep in mind, we've got to start somewhere, and go where the money is. That's just a reality of life.
So we got a gentleman here, a gentleman there, and I'm gonna have a point of privilege, because I really want to highlight the Hamtramck case and talk about all the work the plaintiffs went in to bring the case and to struggle for it. So you're not off the hook, because it's a story that really shows that people can make a difference. And so I'm gonna come back to you on that, but go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for, all four of you for being on the panel, but my question is, so like, every decade or so in Detroit and in the metro region, there like arises this like massive proposal for like either a city or like a regional transit system, and it never seems to go through. And you guys hit on that, all of you, but like I think a decade ago there was a push for a bus rapid transit system, and then a few years ago Detroit Future City came out with like a citywide sort of thing, and neither of them are implemented or going to be implemented. I just wanted to hear your reactions and how your reactions to just regional systems in general like that, but also like how Detroit Future City's plan could have been better, how the one a decade ago could have been better as well.
So we'll do a historical sweep. I'll ask Heather to kind of think and orient us in terms of the history of transportation and regionalism in city-suburb relations. Then I'll ask Ruth to kind of land the plane and say, well, what can we do now, Detroit Future City, other things?
Well, just really briefly, you're right, there's been multiple plans in multiple decades to get a more regional solution to transit, not just transit, schools, everything else. I mean, we've had many regional proposals that have failed. I personally think it's because we try sometimes to just appeal to what's in it for you, rather than make the case that this is good for the region. This is where I get back to this public good argument. Because when we have tried to approach it in terms of this is good for you, people are not, I mean, sometimes people really feel it's better for them to be isolated in an all-white suburb in their car, let's be honest. And so it's not necessarily good for them, from their point of view, to have a regional transit system. So we've never really done the work of making the argument that this is good for all the reasons that Ruth says it's good, in a broader public good argument. And then it's almost like, I mean, dare I say it, shaming this region into doing something that is good for all of us.
rather than what's in it for you. I think we failed on the what's in it for you argument.
I'd ask you to think of the 4 Ps. We need some plan, a regional plan that everyone has an opportunity to participate in. We may not agree on everything, but I think when people feel they've had an opportunity to get information and participate in the process, it is going to get more support. So a good plan. 2, we need political will. 3, we need public will. And 4, we got to pay for it. I don't know with any of those other plans we had all 4. I'm not sure you have it now, but I think this is the best chance because the Regional Transit Authority was created with the ability to put it on the ballot in 4 counties without going to any municipal, city council, town council, township, nobody, county exec, nobody. So with that authority, I think there's a big difference. And that it was created, I don't like how it was created basically a 5 white man, well, Bing, he was in the room. So 4 white, he was in the room, I'm trying to be careful, I'm trying to be careful. And they had a handshake deal and basically went through the House, Senate, and Governor Snyder signed off on it with absolutely no amendment, none. Because I think there was a commitment that for the region to really prosper, in any way you look at it, there needed to be a regional transit authority.
And probably the closest we ever got was in the 1980s, right? Sort of late 70s, 1980s, when there was strong state pressure to do it, some promise of federal money to do it, and it was really the divisiveness between the suburbs and the city that prevented that from happening, and that produced the People Mover as being this kind of vestige of something that was a much broader plan. So the format is this gentleman, then I'm going to have my point of privilege and bring back the Garrett versus Hamtramck case, and then we'll go to Mr. Goodman, and other people will sort of queue up. So that's the next one. So keep that, and then we'll go. So yes, sir.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you all for your time, experiences, and resources. My question is a little bit of a tangent, but I want to ask you guys, how do we reconcile battling the effects of gentrification in Detroit with the fact that right now we're on a university center, and by default, there is going to be gentrification in this area as students come in from out of the city. So how do we reconcile the fact that we want to battle the effects of gentrification, but we exist in it, and what can we do to help citizens in this area? What models are there?
That's a huge question, but I'm gonna attempt to say a couple things. You mentioned that we're in a university center. You mentioned that we're in the university center, right? Is that, or you mean like the center of university?
Like a campus area.
So the only answer I can give, and Piper's still here?
I'm here.
Do you want to speak about the space we're in right now in one way to answer that question?
Yeah, I can.
Why don't you do that? She'll say it much better than I would have said it. But I can't put the mic over there or it's going to explode. You come over here.
Okay, thanks. Peace, everybody. And thanks. That was rich and awesome. You guys appreciate that?
Yes.
Show them. Okay, thanks. So this is East Michigan Environmental Action Council. I actually have the sweatshirt on. So this is from the youth program, Young Educators Alliance. So this is a historic space. Is that yeah. So you're in a historic space. The history is like really rich and really long. So since all of you are in university, or most of you, I'm gonna challenge you to like use your university skills and like do some research around how extensive it is. I will say that it's historically a social justice space. A lot of work has been done here. A lot of work has been incubated here. The UU Church itself has been a space where many communities are welcome. And so that's why when you go in there and people like my Uber drivers like, you have a red, black, and green flag and a rainbow flag? And I'm like, yeah, and all kinds of flags in there because It's really important, this space serves as an important space where we can have these kinds of conversations. And this is a safe space to have this conversation, so that's why we want to keep the space going in this way, because we need to have these conversations, right? Like, do you guys feel like a little bit more enlightened about maybe some of the reasons that we're, being impacted by things? Or did any of the historical information like resonate with people at all? A little bit, like a medium or a lot? Like, who was like, you heard this before, been there, done that? Who was like, oh, I think maybe? But who's like, yeah, I get it. Like, who's that person? Okay, that's good, that's good. So, I will say a lot of social justice work is being done here. You can put justice pretty much in front of anything. So like food justice, racial equity. We're working on water right now. And so when you think about environmental justice, a lot of times we think about environmentalists. And so when we think about environmentalists, we think about people who are like saving whales, which we love whales. We love our whales, right? Go whales! But when we talk about environmental justice in urban environments, what we mean is it's the land, the air, the water, and the people. Yay, people. And so for us, the people are really important. These conversations, having space to do strategy, having space to learn about history, like all these things are really important. We're really blessed and thankful that Peter is here, and Eliza and Craig and all you guys can have these conversations. I know there's a Facebook page as well, and I can post like different events and things that we have here so you can really see the fullness, because I couldn't even like tell you the fullness of the work that we do, but it's just think of everything that would involve caring for, protecting, and keeping our environment safe. And then what does that word environment mean? Right, so it's also it's rights and the right to uphold our rights, but then it's also us really connecting with each other as human beings and really working so that we have a better world. Does that make sense? So I know that's like a lot, and nothing at the same time. And the reason I'm putting it so cursory in that way is because number one, I'll make sure that Mr. Register has the different events that we do, and then I would ask that sometimes get on that bus and come down here and visit us, because we got a lot of cool stuff going on, okay? Don't just come for this, like come down, hang out, come see what's going on, because we got a lot of cool stuff in the city, okay? Yay!
Just to add to that, the point about gentrification tied to what she just said, just to go back to your question, I think it's really important. In the midst of these sites of gentrification, there's always these incredible spaces like this space that are really important to support. So that's really what you're getting at, I think. So to keep supporting these, make sure they don't get shut down, make sure they don't get bought out, so that there's this new condo that goes up right here on the space, because this important work is going up. But there's another piece to what you asked, I think that's really worth talking about, which is gentrification and justice don't necessarily have to, believe it or not, they don't necessarily have to be so opposed. Because part of what we say when we say gentrification is, oh, well, we'd like some nice housing and some street lights and some retail and maybe some places to eat. None of that has to be unjust, as long as some of it's also for the public, right? And a lot of it's reserved for the public, and that the developers are forced to still respond to the public. And that's all through laws and legislations and policies. Gentrification is most devastating when the developers can do whatever they want, when nobody is regulating them, when nobody is saying, sure, you can put up this apartment complex, but what about the 39 people you just moved out of there, right? So this is all about politics. And if a community is going to gentrify, we can determine what it's going to look like.
And just to piggyback on that, with the Hamtramck situation was Sarah Garrett, obviously didn't work alone, but it was important that even though she's obviously no longer alive, and my parents who were, and all the other parents who are no longer alive, I'm second generation and I benefit from this. And that's important that we're included. And like I said, I am blessed, and let me tell you, people say, oh, you're the luckiest person I know. No, I am blessed that I get to benefit from what my parents started. You know, and I plan, and because I'm blessed, I'm not gonna just sit back and go, okay, I'm gonna enjoy this in 15, because the agreement is, I get to, after 15 years, the condo is mine. You know, I can sell it, I'm downtown Hamtramck, the cost is only gonna go up, because it's already gone up, which is unusual in the inner city Detroit, but anyway, I benefit from it. And my blessing, I plan to go on and hopefully create and make sure everyone is included. My family, make sure I hold on to it, pay the taxes on it, pay the insurance on it, so that I can pass it down to the next generation. So that's important that people are included. And even though I think the plan was that the plaintiffs would die off and it would go away. Well, no, we haven't gone away. We're still here. And the lawsuit is still, it hasn't completely closed yet, but, you know, 3 more houses, and it will go on. You know, we will pass it on. And that's important.
I will give a little bit of background on the case so people get some of the context, and I'll go to Bill for the question, and then over here for the question, and I'll queue up others. But it really is a plaintiff story, right? And so the Garretts, the members of your parents' generation, fought hard. Because what happened was there was a conscious process, and this was a Judge Keith opinion. So directing the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, we feel very much kinship with Deborah and the plaintiffs. Goes in front of Judge Keith, but it was a conscious process of citing I-75, not the way it was originally, but the way that would actually go through the African-American neighborhood. Right? There was a policy of depopulation, right? And the depopulation was specifically targeted in the language of the time, Judge Keith, and it was common in other things, called it Negro removal. Right? And so a whole series of things that were called development, urban renewal, were also very consciously targeted at the African American community, and it was successful. Right? It drove your family out. Right? And her story about them actually destroying the houses where people are still almost living in them was true. I mean, there's an absolutely callousness involved. And then these plaintiff class was spread out, and it's like the diaspora. And now you imagine how you fight against that. Now, normally in a lawsuit, you're going to get damages, right? But Judge Keith is not a normal judge. Right? He says that's really just a tax to let you be unjust, right? So I just force you to pay. That's just taxing injustice, right? What he forced them to do, and this is why it took 40 years, but there's genius in it, he says you have to rebuild those houses, you have to move those people back into those homes. Right? Radical form of justice, right? Of which the beneficiaries of you and other plaintiffs, but largely children, grandchildren. Right? And he has held jurisdiction over that case for 40 years, and he still does. Right? He's 93 years young. Right? And he's not going anywhere until this is solved, and they're 3 houses away. Right? So you're sort of seeing this epic struggle coming through, and that's why I was so excited to have Deborah here and sharing that story. But it really is the plaintiffs, right? It's the people that moved that. But it's the judge that sort of had the inspiration to say it's not enough just to pay, right? We have to recreate the community and put people back in. And that's not easy to do. Bill.
I'm going to stand because I'm struggling with a cold here so that people can hear me. I'm not talking long, but as a historical footnote, I wonder if there's anybody here, Heather in particular, seems to have some historical vantage point, that knows that in 1946, the UAW sued the auto industry, sued General Motors for conspiring to block public transportation in the city of Detroit. Now, you know that?
Yeah, that's right.
And what it says is, and I think it's important because you talk about putting the interests of the community ahead of your own personal interest in the pocketbook. Here are auto workers trying to embellish and strengthen this community over their own immediate, somewhat narrower interests. So it's impressive.
And they did it with healthcare too, Bill. They advocated, UAW was advocating that everybody should have public health, that the government should pay for healthcare even though they were getting benefits from their employer. And basically the employer said, shut up, at least you're getting healthcare, so go away.
Well, let's hear it from a truly progressive organization.
I wanted to go back to the gentrification question. We have unpaid internships, if anyone's interested, and one of the questions I ask is, how do you feel about non-relative pronouns? And the reason I ask is, if you come into Detroit and talk about them, they, those, and have a savior mentality, we're gonna help them. It's probably not gonna be an internship at our organization, even if it's unpaid and you're gonna donate your time and talents. Because what equity is understanding privilege, and if you don't understand, there are a lot of ways you can learn more, and more than just having head knowledge, have heart knowledge of what that means, and make a quality decision to change your actions and your attitudes. And it starts with your words. That's as an individual. As a part of a group, whether a class, a company, a union, a law firm, you can change how things are implemented. And change isn't always bad, but a lot of changes are bad because of who's making those decisions and how it hurts people. So start with yourself and then go outward.
And anybody else want to queue up and kind of sort of keep a running queue?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask what you thought as a group about transit-oriented developments as proposed by the Congress for Green Urbanism and sort of their potential for addressing a lot of the issues we've been talking about. I don't know if you know about TODs, but they're just like pocket planned communities that are connected by some kind of public transit, and sort of how those could be implemented in Detroit, or if they should be implemented, and how they could maybe address the issues we've been discussing.
I don't personally know new urbanism, old, middle-aged urban, I don't know all about that, so I'll just start with that. Transit-oriented development
is like any other development. It can be done well, it can be done equitably, it can be done within a framework of laws that allow, prohibit, encourage good development. And the problem when we say good transit, good development, good regionalism, that does depend on the eye of the beholder. But I think when you have a process where more voices are represented, where people have access to information, most of the development in this area, there's a public hearing, and really the plan is 99% or 99.9% final. So I have nothing wrong with transit-oriented development. I have a problem with how development has been done in this region, though.
And like, it would depend on where the pockets are, right? So if we just put the pocket in Midtown, because that's where all the hipsters are who want to get around, then, that's good. That's a good start, but not if it's just there. So I guess it's the implementation. And I don't know enough about it either, but that's just my gut reaction.
Can I just add one thing?
Stay away from
I'll just one thing to add that complicates, and I don't know a huge amount about TOD either, but a fact that we should recognize in this area is that 60 to 70% of Detroiters who work, who are employed, leave Detroit to get to their jobs. So where the jobs are in these maps too, and the kind of reverse commute that sort of region that we live in. And so development needs to emerge, but where do the mass jobs, this is a huge question that goes far beyond this particular evening, but where do the masses of jobs end up, and who are those jobs for? And how far do you have to move to get to them? Right now the imbalance is so extreme. That's not to say that what you're suggesting couldn't help, but to leave this city, go an hour to get to your job that's often minimum wage is a tremendous injustice that just complicates everything else.
I'm going to have two questions. I'm going to privilege of comment, and then this woman, and then Lila in the back. There's one graphic, you talk about Detroit Future City. I think one of the most important graphics in Detroit Future City illustrates those things about employment. And anytime you see anybody talk about poverty, think about where are the jobs. right? So you can't just sort of brand as, you know, a bunch of poor people or below the poverty level. The next is, where did those jobs go? Right? That whole sort of notion of the story and part of where we have the presence of opportunity, the absence of opportunity, is that deindustrialization, the relocation. But that one graphic in Detroit Future City says that there's one job in Detroit for every 4 people. Right? And that's just off the charts. That's just almost unimaginable. One job for every 4 people. Says 60% of the people in Detroit that are working outside the city. And that's the phenomenon that Craig is describing about people having to go outside without good public transportation, without access to a car, right? To jobs, right, that are largely low-wage service jobs, right? Same graphic, right? 70% of the jobs in the city are held by people who live outside the city.
Who are not paying city taxes.
Yeah.
So there's a sucking sound of money coming out of the
Yeah.
city.
So these maps and spatial sort of portrayals are very powerful. So sort of think about that bizarre dance that happens every day, right? Of people getting up and trying to get to work outside of the city, other people coming in, leaving the city, right? And a lot of those 70% of the jobs are much better jobs, right? So jobs are important. The other thing I just sort of want to say about this arc that we're on, we're kind of grounded in history, but we're going to come back to gentrification. Right? We're going to come back to employment, we're going to come back to water shutoffs, we're coming back to land, coming back to development, and then ending with this notion of what are alternatives. Right? So your sort of minds are going in the correct way. Right? We're trying to lay the historical foundation to frame that, so when we get there we can not just sort of think about this with the last 15 minutes that the American memory has, right? But we're going to come back to these, because these are critically important issues. Yes, ma'am?
My name is Brenda McGatton, native Detroiter. At least I wasn't born here, but I was raised here. And I grew up just a few blocks from here in an area, 12, now they call it Rosa Parks, and Forest. That area, urban renewal came through, destroyed an intact neighborhood, working class community. One of the things that's happening to a lot of Detroiters is that has not been mentioned, is the high cost we pay for auto insurance. Many people who move here into the city, I work at Michigan and 3rd. Many of my co-workers who work in the city, they, even when they move back to the city, they don't use the addresses. And let me tell you a secret. When I say secret, I found this out just early this year because I had to get another car. I went to Costco, got my insurance for them. They don't look at your zip code, so it's considerably cheaper. Most people don't know that. Auto insurance, the Costco's is considerably cheaper because they do not look at your zip code. But you cannot have more than 3, like if your car was vandalism or whatever, you know, claims. You can have more than 3 claims. The other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that a lot of times when people look at individuals who work in Detroit, my mother during the, I want to say in the 60s, was able to work out in Utica for Ford Motor Company, but she was shot at. And so people go through a lot trying to provide for their families. And I may get somebody want to throw some tomatoes at me, but I'm a Spartan. My sister graduated from the University of Michigan. It's okay. And there's a lot of hope in this city in spite of the racism that you as young people need to fight, because some of us older people did not follow through on some things that we should have followed through on. So you all are carrying the bar.
Thank you. No, and I want to say the genius of the format is the expertise that's here. And so I want to thank